Hi, I'm Simon K. Jones, and you're listening to the audio version of Tales from the Triverse, my ongoing weekly serial that is actually soon going to be finished. Today's chapter is called Parliament. London, Mid-Earth, 1980, July. The unknown was part of the job. Clark had made peace with that decades back, on his first case as a junior officer, stepping into an unfamiliar room, inserting himself into the lives of others, learning their secrets and fears, untangling past events, building a timeline from scattered scraps of information. Sometimes they found the perp, sometimes not. It was the job. Some things became known, others remained hidden. Dealing with victims and criminals had a distance to it, because it was about other people. Ever since Callahan had died, that separation had been turned on its head. Clark had been at the centre of things for far longer than he was comfortable. He was trapped at a surprise birthday party, all the attention on him, and on Styles and Chakraborty and Kaminsky. Holland had been in deeper than any of them, and he'd managed to get out. Clark wasn't sure that was going to be an option for the rest of them. Trying to shut the thoughts from his mind was impossible. The Joint Council tower had come down, quite possibly with the others still inside. There were rumours that a megaship had been sighted transiting the portals earlier in the day, so God knows what that meant for Styles and the others over on Palinor. It wasn't inconceivable that he was the last of them still standing. In which case, he'd better concentrate and get it done. The jewelled clock towers of the palace stood proudly over the river, their faces illuminated in the gathering gloom of the evening. It had taken Clark most of his adult life to realise that Max Earth's equivalent to the Palace of Westminster had only a single tower. The display of supposed superiority was the perfect encapsulation of the Kingdom of Great Britain's attitude since the joining. 2 centuries of posturing and playing catch-up, always envious of what had been achieved in the future visions of Max Earth. Those clock faces, malleable and patriotic, representative of so much. Clark had once looked upon them with immense pride, as a young man on the beat in London. In later years they'd been a symbol of retreat and stagnation. During his exile on the other side of the portal, he couldn't bear to see a photograph or postcard bearing their iconic designs, co-opted as they had been by Prime Minister Maxwell and his neo-fascist goons. Hitler had not existed on Mid-Earth. Mussolini had never come to power in Italy. The 2 global conflagrations of Max Earth's 20th century had never happened on Mid-Earth, yet that had not stopped people following in their footsteps. The blueprint was always the same. Nigel Maxwell was a pale imitation of his alternate history idols, but that hadn't stopped him from being dangerous. The goalposts shifted, the scapegoats had different names, but the playbook remained. Soon Maxwell would share another recurring trait with his adopted heroes: utter defeat. "Once we're in," Clark said, projecting his voice as best he could to the gathered crowd outside the palace entrance. "Exercise restraint. We need minimal injuries. Do not damage the building or any of the offices inside. This needs to be clean." Varco nodded and relayed the message, their booming roar spreading considerably further. Clark could hear the message being passed along from the gates all the way back down Whitehall and the embankment. The uprising had pushed past the neutered defences, the crew in the Joint Council tower having completed their task at a cost he still didn't know. The Koth, a former ambassador, a former inhabitant of the non-human ghetto and current resistance leader, looked to Clark. "On your signal, detective." He nodded. There were journalists somewhere in the crowd, which meant getting the story straight. "Open the doors." 2 of Varco's lieutenants braced themselves, then heaved their shoulders against the entrance to the palace. The doors shook, then there was a splintering sound and they swung open. Westminster Hall beckoned, its enormity making even the gathered Koth seem small. There was little resistance as they passed through into the corridors, heading in the direction of the 2 chambers. They split up, Varco taking a contingent to the Lord's Chamber, while Clark continued to the Commons. He'd been to Westminster before as a uniformed officer, but had never ventured beyond the Great Hall. He had never imagined returning as a revolutionary. The notion was absurd, was a joke, even backed by a growing crowd of supporters from across the Triverse. Clark couldn't help but question himself. He had never been a radical thinker, had never thought much about power or politics until it had been forced upon him. and following a certain gentle prodding and poking from a couple of young, idealistic and naive partners, Callaghan had warmed up his mind, and Styles had taken him the rest of the way. Maybe not so naive, after all. The doors to the Commons chamber were barricaded, with half a dozen armed men wearing the insignia of the Earth First Special Branch, their not-so-secret police offshoot that had been home to the thugs and corrupt officials drawn to power over the previous half-decade. The Met had always had its problems, and Earth First had embraced all of them. Each of them dropped their guns at the first sight of Clark and his entourage. Upon closer inspection, as the Earth First loyalists were secured, it became apparent that they hadn't been defending the chamber, but had instead been attempting to break into it. The thick wooden door was covered with scratches and dents from axe and crowbar impacts. "This is former police detective Yannick Clark," he announced, hoping his voice would carry through the door. He'd practiced this moment. "I'm here with a contingent of supporters to liberate Westminster and return power to the electorate. I have the backing of Commissioner Matthew Graves, DCI Stephen Walpole and DI Robert Ford. With me are former Ambassador to Palinor Varco, and many others. What is your response?" There was silence. Then after several seconds the sound of furniture being moved from the other side of the doors. One of them opened a crack, revealing an unexpectedly familiar face. "D.I. Morgan," Clark said, his surprise clearly evident on his face. Lois Morgan smiled at him through the gap. "Clark, Ford told me you were up to something. We've been protecting the MPs in the chamber. What's the situation?" "The palace is secure as far as we know. The streets outside as well. There are thousands of us out here, Gov." The doors opened a little wider, and she gestured for him to enter. Varco accompanied, with a small team of Koth, humans and Ain Fa. The MPs were all huddled at the far end of the chamber, near the dispatch boxes. Some of them were on their feet and stepped forward. To one side, seated on the benches and flanked by armed police officers, were ministers that Clark recognised as Earth First representatives. "They tried to round up all the other party MPs," Morgan said. "I don't like to think what they had in mind for them, but we got here first. I'm not sure how long we could have held up in here if you hadn't arrived." "It's over then." She threw him a cynical glance. "The PM's in the wind. Maxwell hasn't been seen since the Koth broke out of the East End camp." Shit. He still had no idea what was happening on Palinor. Success here didn't necessarily mean victory on the other side of the portal. Nisha, Zoltan and the others were still unaccounted for. "We'll find him," Morgan said. "We'll find all of them. You should see the records they've been keeping. I don't think they ever expected to be out of power, so the paper trail is likely to go right to the top." She sighed. "Not exactly what we joined the force for, is it?" Clark felt more tired than he'd ever been in his life. His heart was still hammering, the adrenaline having nowhere to go. "I should have retired years ago." He pinched the bridge of his nose between thumb and forefinger and chuckled. "I could have been sat in the pub this whole time." She clapped him on the shoulder. "But then where would we be?" Thanks for listening. You can find out more, leave comments, and all of that good stuff over on the newsletter at simonkjones.substack.com.